Just as Russia seemed on the verge of a new golden age, tragedy struck. Tsar Alexander II had been an avid smoker and an aficionado with pipes. However, this hobby of his would cause sore throats and frequent colds later on in his life. It wasn't until 1877 that doctors soon uncovered that the Tsar had throat cancer, specifically of the larynx. After several years of failed treatments, all hidden from the public eye, Alexander II succumbed to the cancer in August of 1878. His death came as a hard blow to the unexpecting Russian public. Thousands of kulaks and emancipated serfs came out in droves of thousands to see the funeral train procession for the man who brought Russia greater political glory, enhanced political reform, and increased liberty for her people. His son, the new Tsar Alexander III, was now left in the unenviable position of both living up to his father's legacy and inheriting his father's problems, in particular, the problem of nationalism. While nationalism had allowed Russian expansion into the Mediterranean and the liberation of the southern Slavs, Alexander III was skeptical of these radical changes to the European status quo. Because of his father's wars, nationalist uprisings were springing up not only in the Ottoman Empire, but across Eastern Europe, and threatened Russia as well, with its Baltic, Polish, and Finnic minorities. Therefore, instead of declaring war to free the Romanian and Serbian peoples living in Austria-Hungary, Alexander III proposed a non-aggression pact with both Austria-Hungary and Germany. Domestically, he focused his political efforts on Russification, the quashing of local, ethnic cultures and religions to integrate them into Orthodox Russian culture and life. Many in Russia saw the new Tsar's policies as a betrayal of his father's, leading to many small but widespread revolts across Russia for the first 3 years of his reign. While Europe believed Alexander II could transform Russia into a more modern liberal state, they believe now that Alexander III will continue to conserve Russia as an autocratic monarchy. Bismarck, for his part, is satisfied that peace with Russia will hold for the time being, especially as he is drawing up plans to bring in more nations into the Central Powers to challenge British hegemony. However, this dramatic shift in Russian foreign policy could prove even more destructive to the European status quo, as the established alliances are now being called into question. Argentina has always been the problem child of the Americas. As a fragile confederation of states, the Argentine Confederation had managed to irritate and raise tensions with its powerful neighbors, Brazil and Chile. To compensate for its own lack of population and manpower, Argentine President Manuel de Rosas launched a series of military campaigns disturbing the region, breaking up the Peru-Bolivian Confederation and establishing puppet regimes in Uruguay, Paraguay, and Bolivia. When the local leaders, or caudillos, believed de Rosas was becoming a dictator, Justo José de Urquiza, the governor of Entre Rios, launched a revolt against de Rosas with Brazilian and Chilean aid. However, de Rosas was able to defeat de Urquiza by capitalizing on fears of a Brazilian invasion and motivated the populace against the rebels. Now proclaimed as the savior of the Confederation, de Rosas declared himself the sole ruler of Argentina, the Emperor of Argentina, in the mock style of the Emperor of Brazil, and limited the power of the caudillos, who are now seen as traitors and public enemies. Although this move gave him greater popularity and political power at home, it only further isolated Argentina politically. Not only Brazil and Chile, but also the United States opposed this new monarchy. Therefore, if the United States would not support him, de Rosas looked abroad for new allies. Argentine diplomats tried courting the French Republic, the German Empire, and even Spain, their former colonial masters, in hopes of gaining insurance against a Brazilian attack. Bismarck, however, thinking Argentina was a rogue state, rebuffed their efforts, thinking that an alliance with Argentina could entangle Germany in a war with Brazil, and maybe even the United States. However, after the Russian Non-Aggression Pact was signed with Alexander III, Bismarck felt safer and more confident in signing an alliance with Argentina, especially if Argentina, with all its resources, could be brought into the German sphere of influence. The alliance with Germany is a slap in the face to the United States, who see the agreement as a violation of the Monroe Doctrine. However, there is nothing that can be done short of war, that is. It remains to be seen whether de Rosas will be content to sit on his laurels, or whether he will use his newfound allies to rile up trouble in South America. With peace restored between the Central Powers, the Anglo-Russian Alliance, and the French Entente, Bismarck formally convened the Concert of Europe, resurrecting the discarded Union of Nations to preserve peace and the status quo in Europe. With the Balkan question answered and the Ottoman Empire expelled from Europe, it was now Austria-Hungary that needed the concert's attention. By mediating agreement between the great powers of Europe, Bismarck believed he could prevent the next great European war, especially after the Summer War proved how widespread and how deadly such a war could be with new technology. For his own part, Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph wanted to pursue more confederalized reforms, such as letting more minorities have a say in government. By establishing a triple monarchy of Austrians, Hungarians, and Slavs, Franz Joseph hoped to free the empire from the yoke of Hungarian control and frustration. The Slavs across the empire were ecstatic at the hope of participating in the government. Croats and Slovenes, Slavic minorities that had been dutiful and loyal to the empire, saw this as the reward for their long service. Likewise, the Bohemians looked forward to the day when the crown of Bohemia would once again have equal footing with that of Austria and Hungary. The Hungarians, however, were furious at Franz Joseph's gesturing and attempted to muzzle any talk of trialism or Slavic representation. This conflict of interest came to a head on the streets of Prague, where the historic Kingdom of Bohemia once was established. When Austro-Hungarian troops arrived on the scene to put down Bohemian revolts, many Bohemian intellectuals, political thinkers, and political writers approached Britain, France, and Germany to intervene against the Austro-Hungarian oppression. While Bismarck would normally have dismissed such nationalistic requests, he understood that if the great powers did not intervene, the problem could snowball into a new wave of nationalism, like in 1848. Therefore, he convened the Conference of Berlin, with representatives from Britain, Russia, Italy, France, and of course, Austria-Hungary. Bismarck, ever the pragmatist, argued in favor of the triple monarchy of Austria-Hungary-Bohemia, believing Austria-Hungary was too weak in holding its empire together. France, unsurprisingly, opposed this motion, as it was determined to thwart any attempt by Germany to expand its influence, thinking correctly that Bismarck hoped to bring Austria-Hungary into the Central Powers. What was surprising was the Russian response. Unlike his father, Alexander III wanted to preserve the existing governments and political structures against the popular will, thinking that to make such concessions to the Bohemian minority in Austria-Hungary would lead to similar revolts and revolutions within his own Russian Empire. Alexander III's position caused a split between the more sympathetic United Kingdom and the more intransigent Russia. Eager to capitalize on the opportunity, Bismarck tempted the British ambassadors by offering to make Victoria's son, Arthur, the King of Bohemia, if Britain would support Germany. The ambassadors rebuffed this obvious bribe, but nonetheless agreed to support the German cause. Now, with British and Italian support, Bismarck believed he could force the French to agree to his demands. However, the new French government, under the leadership of the glory-hound general Georges Boulanger, had other ideas. The more practical, level-headed government of Jules Grévy had come under scrutiny following the Legion of Honor scandal by his son-in-law, leading to the collapse of his government and the return of Georges Boulanger, the popular war hero who emerged out of his self-imposed exile to restore French glory from the clutches of the perfidious Bismarck. With France eager for a fight, the Bohemian crisis had become the Bohemian War. Bismarck's brilliant plan for peace had failed, and now he had to win another war. Already the war was off to a poor start for Germany. The Netherlands voiced support for Germany, but was itself entangled in liberating Flanders from its southern neighbor, at last having its revenge on the breakaway Kingdom of Belgium. Similarly, Alexander III wanted nothing to do with the war, which he considered another one of Bismarck's harebrained schemes, breaking his alliance with the United Kingdom. Most startling was the performance of the French military, having learned its lessons from the Franco-Spanish and the Austro-Italian wars on the importance of mobilization and fast movement. Boulanger personally led the assault across the Rhine River, penetrating deep into Alsace-Lothringen, the former Alsace-Lorraine, while the French military in the south did well against an unprepared Italian garrison, making its way through Piedmont. The most glorious moment for France was the British invasion of Normandy under the command of General Cyril Hope. When the British army threatened Paris itself, a French force under Thibaut Foret made a successful counterattack against the invaders, while the British newspapers mocked and made fun of Hope's failed invasion, with names like Hope's Folly and False Hope. Despite French success, the same could not be said about Austria-Hungary, which completely collapsed in the face of the German onslaught. Romania, once again sensing weakness, instigated the Fourth Balkan War in the hopes of gaining the Erdely region that she had been promised in the Treaty of San Stefano. Once more, the countrysides of the empire were ravaged and pillaged, leaving many without food or homes. Consequently, more and more people flocked to the nationalist causes of their local states, not out of a desire for political freedom, but simply out of necessity to form a new government that could protect and support them. Both Franz Joseph and even Bismarck begged France to concede defeat in this unwinnable war, but Boulanger was determined to fight to the end. However, while Boulanger was making a name for himself on the battlefield, his Republican enemies were stirring trouble for him in Paris, incriminating and arresting his enemies in the government before recalling him from command in the field. Realizing that even if he won the war, he had lost France, Boulanger immediately handed command to one of his junior lieutenants and fled with his mistress, the Madame Bonnemont, into neighboring Belgium, while the new government negotiated peace. In the end, it was Franz Joseph's brother Maximilian who was offered the throne of the newly independent Bohemia. Bismarck's new concert was unable to stem the tide of nationalism that had made its way up from the Balkans, but he had successfully undermined the Anglo-Russian alliance. But before he could exploit this rift, the German Emperor Wilhelm I passed away, leaving Germany with a new Kaiser, Friedrich III, and this new Kaiser, like Russia's new Tsar, had very different ideas for a new foreign policy. On March 17, 1880, Bismarck had invited some of the premier diplomats from both Britain and France to the then-occupied Vienna in another attempt to secure peace. While the peace process would take another month to complete, one of the topics of the conference was the question of Africa, namely Transvaal. Transvaal, an old Dutch colony, enjoyed French protection, while Britain was eager to incorporate the territory into its South African colony. One of the main complaints of British diplomat Edward Mallet was the rumor that the Transvaali were participating in the ongoing slave trade of the continent, and that Britain had a right to intervene on their behalf. To soothe over tensions, Bismarck offered a treaty for the conference, in which both Britain and France asserted that they would commit themselves to abolishing the slave trade on the African continent, with the implication that France would rein in the Transvaal government from engaging in the slave trade. The other important implication of this conference was that it justified the use of force by these two powers to end the slave trade in Africa, even if that meant invading African nations. It was this argument that Benjamin Disraeli used to annex the Khedive of Egypt to stop the flow of slaves down the Nile River. France would further expand by annexing Morocco and Madagascar. Similarly, both Britain and France would begin carving their way through West Africa, overthrowing the tribes and caliphates that had been engaging in the slave trade for centuries, unmolested until now. Soon, Germany and later the other European powers would scramble for Africa in the same name of liberty, civilization, and the white man's burden. Portugal would expand deeper into Angola. Germany would snatch territory around Cameroon and the Horn of Africa. The Netherlands would expand their holdings in West Africa and Eritrea. Denmark would enlist British assistance in claiming Tunisia and even invading the Ottoman Empire to claim Cyrene. Sweden would establish the Congo Free State, giving them a firm foothold in the heart of the continent. Almost all of Europe was taking part in this unprecedented land grab. There was always the looming threat of colonial conflict between the powers, but for the time being, the enemy for the European settlers is not their continental neighbors, but the Heart of Darkness. Friedrich III, despite being largely sidelined in the government for his liberal views, nonetheless had had significant influence over his father, being one of the leading voices in favor of a new German empire. Now as emperor, he, like Alexander III, hoped his reign would be one of internal reform with less emphasis on foreign expansion. To this end, he drew up plans for a more parliamentary government and a more limited role for the Chancellor, taking inspiration from the United Kingdom, the home of his wife Victoria. Bismarck, seeing his power threatened, did all he could do to secretly thwart the plans of the new Kaiser. However, even the best laid plans can come undone, and the collapse of some of Bismarck's plans portended his demise. The Central Powers, Bismarck's brainchild, was intended to be a united continental alliance against the dominant Britain and the aggressive Russia. While the Anglo-Russian alliance stood firm, the powers remained united, But once the alliance was dissolved, Friedrich III did not see the need to maintain the Central Powers. Bismarck argued that the Central Powers were critical allies in order to maintain Germany's dominant role in Europe. However, these critical allies would soon make life difficult for both Friedrich and Bismarck. When the Bohemian War erupted, not only did the Netherlands not participate in the conflict, but also caused geopolitical scandal by invading Belgium. International outcry came from London, where Queen Victoria demanded that Germany reign in the Netherlands. This caused some embarrassment to Bismarck, who prevented the Netherlands from claiming complete control of the country, arguing that their refusal to fight France had cost them German support. However, through some very questionable means, while the Netherlands did not take Flanders proper, they were able to establish an independent government through a plebiscite vote that the weakened Belgium was forced to accept. Despite this victory, King Alexander of the Netherlands felt betrayed by Germany and left the Central Powers, signing an alliance with the French Republic a few years later. Additionally, Germany's two other allies began stirring up trouble in the Mediterranean, where Spain laid claim to Morocco and Italy laid claim to the Ionian Islands. Because Morocco was under the protection of France and Greece was under the protection of Britain, Spain and Italy began rattling their sabers, eager for another war with Britain and France. Friedrich, however, had had enough of war, and even Bismarck had to agree with him. The victories of the Central Powers had not satiated their appetites. Rather, it made them more bold and aggressive in acquiring more territory. When Friedrich threatened to cancel the alliance if both Spain and Italy did not back down, the weak Spanish government, knowing it could not defeat France alone, conceded. Italy, however, broke its alliance with Germany and made her claims on the islands despite international uproar. In London, the aging Queen Victoria was impressed by her son-in-law's fortitude and resolve in challenging Bismarck and his allies. Many within her circle began openly questioning whether it was better to ally with Germany instead of Russia. With Alexander III reversing many of his father's reforms, perhaps a liberal Germany would better suit British interests. Bismarck, loath to make any alliance with Britain, believed such an alliance would entangle Germany in far overseas conflicts. However, with the Central Powers in tatters, one ally is better than none. Furthermore, Britain had one valuable bargaining chip, Heligoland, an island off the coast of Germany that could serve as a powerful naval base for the new German Navy. On the 29th of April 1881, the ink was dry on a new alliance between the two nations, previously on the road to rivalry and conflict. Time would tell if this upset to continental politics would guarantee peace or war. Political instability and failure have ever been the downfall of Habsburgs. For Ferdinand, it cost him his throne. For Franz Joseph, it cost him his life. On November 7th, 1880, while making a public appearance in Salzburg, in order to rally public support for the Empire amidst the Fourth Balkan War, an unidentified rifleman assassinated him as he was waving from his carriage. The assassin was never discovered, and to this day many wonder who the assassin might have been. Was he a Slavic nationalist, hoping to gain independence for his country? Was he a Hungarian ultranationalist, who thought Franz Joseph was a weak, liberal monarch? Was he an impoverished Austrian, a citizen or nobleman who had lost everything in the constant wars and occupation the empire had undergone? We may never know. What we do know is that his heir apparent the Crown Prince Rudolf was in a highly unenviable position. The first issue on his plate was resolving the Fourth Balkan War. In spite of the protests of Hungary, Rudolf knew there was no way the Empire could defeat Romania after being crushed and humiliated in the Bohemian War. With peace signed with Romania on May 1st, 1882, Rudolf then began the painful process of dividing the management of the empire. Believing that by dividing the empire into a federal model, as had been done in Bohemia, the empire could be preserved and the nationalist elements would be satisfied. He made his uncles, Karl Ludwig and Ludwig Victor, the Grand Duke of Galicia-Lodomeria and the Prince of Bukovina, respectively, while making his daughter, Elizabeth Marie, the nominal Princess of Dalmatia. All the while, he made a concerted effort to divide Austrian territory, while leaving Hungarian territory untouched, so as to avoid the thorny issue of Hungarian ultranationalism. Rudolf thought he was pragmatic. Hungary thought he was weak. On May 18, 1882, almost 3 weeks after peace was signed with Romania, the Hungarian Diet declared independence from the empire. For too long had the Habsburgs failed to defend Hungarian land, so it was time for Hungary to defend herself. Rudolf, powerless to stop Hungary, was ultimately forced to relinquish his claims. Although Hungary could now enjoy its independence, however, she soon learned the difficulty in staving off nationalist revolts and winning wars. Romanian King Carol I declared war on the newly independent Hungary to claim Banat, the remaining territory Russia had promised in the Treaty of San Stefano. He argued he was not breaking the peace, since his treaty was signed with Austria, not Hungary. A week later, Serbia would also join the conflict to claim the Vojvodina region. Finally, even the Italians, who had been unable to claim the Ionian Islands, tried to claim the coveted port of Istria on Hungary's Adriatic coast. With the empire dissolved, the neighboring nations were now free to carve up as much land as they wanted, just as the Western powers were carving up Africa. It was now Central Europe, not the Balkans, that had become the hotbed of Europe. The eagle has fallen. Africa was not the only continent available for colonial exploitation. The French colony in Indochina was proving to be the pride and joy for the luckless French Republic, as colonial prestige and the inflow of resources helped boost public morale and its political image. After the success of claiming the nearby Solomon Islands off the coast of Australia, President Carnot began talks of expansion for the colony to increase overland trade with China, leading to the Tonkin War, in which French forces would march their way to the very border of China itself. A small, short, inglorious affair, the Tonkin War appeared to be drawing to a close, as the Tonkin army was no match for the modern Western army of the French. However, a new contender entered the field that would snatch victory away from France's grasp. China, which had long been watching the increased Western power in India and Indochina, felt threatened by this new European power so close to its borders. Goaded on by court eunuchs and fearful of appearing weak, the Emperor Guangxu declared war on France, pouring his vast armies across the border to challenge the French. The French, although completely unprepared for such a massive assault, made a brave defense at Langson and successfully repelled the Chinese. The Chinese army, realizing their inferior muskets were little match for the new French rifles, focused on liberating Tonkin settlements from French occupation and avoiding direct confrontation with the French army whenever possible. For their own part, The French army, because it could not defeat the sheer number of Chinese forces that had now invaded Indochina, also avoided direct confrontation whenever possible. The result was a bizarre parody of warfare in which Chinese numbers overran Indochina, occupying the whole colony, but were afraid to directly challenge the French. The French, meanwhile, could not afford to split their forces, and thus had to move from settlement to settlement, reasserting control only to lose it a month later when the Chinese forces would return. After 4 years of back and forth, the war soon became an international embarrassment for all parties involved. The French public, at first eager for war, soon began mocking President Carnot's foolish war, or at worst, became openly hostile to him and the Republic. In China, the inability to definitively win the war was putting tremendous strain on the economy, as many peasants that tended the rice fields had been away for months or even years, fighting a war with no end in sight. As neither side seemed able to gain victory, the war may not be decided on the front line, but on the home front. Communism, the ideology to bring about the fulfillment of history, at least as it was advanced by Marx and Engels, had always been an uneasy undercurrent in the 19th century. When the Communist Manifesto was written, amidst the revolutions of 1848, it seemed like the class struggle had begun and the end of capitalism was at hand. However, as the revolts of 1848 had subsided with little success, and nationalism had become the new dominant ideology of Europe, many openly questioned the Marxist understanding of communism. One conflicting interpretation was that of Mikhail Bakunin, who endorsed an anarchist understanding of the workers' revolution. In contrast was Louis Blanqui, who advocated for a top-down revolution advanced by an elite few. These two clashed heads at the First International of 1880, held in Ghent in the newly formed Kingdom of Flanders. Many communists and socialists hoped that these smaller nation-states, with highly concentrated industry, would be the ideal breeding ground for the workers' revolution. One of these revolutionaries, Daniel de Leon, was born in the Dutch Caribbean and used his knowledge of the language to try and organize a proper revolution in the vulnerable new monarchies. However, despite some minor protests across both Flanders and Wallonia, de Leon and his compatriots had been unable to gain any real support and were quashed by the government. While Daniel had been an orthodox Marxist at the time of the International, he was taken in by what he referred to as Blanqui's more pragmatic, sensible approach to revolution. He subsequently fled to France, where this time he published subversive writings to share among France's elite politicians and intellectuals, criticizing the Tonkin War and the failure of President Carnot. But again, like in the Low Countries, communism failed to find favorable soil. While the upper classes agreed with de Leon's critiques of the Third Republic, they were still too conservative and too nationalistic for the cause to gain any ground. They were more sympathetic towards a military Boulanger-esque figure, or a new Napoleon, or even a return of the monarchy to restore French glory and prestige. It was at this stage that de Leon concluded that in order for communism to succeed, it needed to be rebranded and redefined for the coming 20th century. In an age where nationalism and jingoism were depleting wealth and destroying lives, he thought he had to frame communism as a post-nationalist ideology, an antidote to the current ills. To that end, he set out to the one country where he thought his Blancist post-national communism could take root: Austria. To be Austrian in 1883 was to be destitute. destitute of wealth, destitute of property, destitute of security, and perhaps most shockingly, destitute of identity. Both class identity and national identity were being called into question, as Austrian glory had faded, and the Austrian nobility soon found themselves as impoverished as the factory workers and the farmers. The military in particular was loath to continue the fight against nationalist elements in wars they could not win. Some of the breakaway kingdoms from the empire, such as Maximilian's Bohemia and Karl Ludwig's Galicia-Lodomeria, were dominated by socialist politicians and sympathetic intellectuals. These kingdoms were comparatively more stable than Austria and presented fertile ground for a worldwide revolution. It was in this environment that De Leon believed he could find success, with an overwhelming percentage of the population now joining what he considered to be the proletariat, those without the means of production. De Leon believed that he had found the fulfillment of Marxist Communist Manifesto, and believed that his post-national ideology would be able to finally gain victory. Through the use of the party's contacts in Vienna, De Leon was able to rally much of the former nobility, and even some of the military generals, to launch a coup against the now unpopular Emperor Rudolf. Realizing the perilous situation he was in, Rudolf fled to his hunting lodge in Mayerling with his suspected mistress, Baroness Mary Vetsera, while the new revolutionary government established de facto martial law in the city. While the revolution spread its way through the countryside, the other European powers were too preoccupied to intervene on Rudolf's behalf. Germany had rushed to Greece's defense to protect the Ionian Islands from Italy. France was still bogged down in the Tonkin War, and the other European powers were too focused on colonial expansion. By August of 1887, some of the Blancist revolutionaries discovered the dead bodies of both Rudolf and Mary at Mayerling, with the government declaring they had committed suicide. De Leon declared the new Austrian Commune as the beginning of the World Revolution, supporting and promoting the communist cause in other countries. Despite this victory, there are harbingers of failure in De Leon's experiment. The Workers' International, skeptical of De Leon's overt Blanquism, did not announce immediate support. Likewise, the socialist parties in Bohemia and Galicia-Lodomeria distanced themselves from De Leon after rumors circulated that he and his followers had executed both Rudolf and Mary. It remains to be seen whether De Leon's project will last, but it has certainly showcased how communism can win if it is willing to adapt. De Leon's revolution inspired similar revolts in both Romania and Russian Ukraine. It could be that the class struggle, not the national struggle, will come to define the 20th century.